Michael Harper's perfect wedding day shattered the moment Avery Lane stepped into the church with the truth he tried to bury. Michael Harper grew up in a place where reputations were built slowly and judged harshly. His town valued tradition, predictability, and quiet lives lived without scandal. From childhood, he learned that being accepted required following unspoken rules. He carried those lessons into adulthood, shaping himself into a man everyone trusted. He worked hard, volunteered when asked, and kept his personal life hidden behind a practiced calm that made people believe he had nothing to hide. In reality, his life held a complicated truth he never intended anyone to discover. His relationship with Avery Lane didn't begin as a secret, but it became one almost immediately. Avery lived in the next city over, far from the small-town watchfulness Michael grew up under. She was open about who she was, proud of her identity, and unafraid of judgment. Michael admired her confidence, but he feared it as well. To him, Avery represented both comfort and danger. Comfort in the way she accepted him without the expectations his town imposed, and danger because he knew his community would never accept their relationship. What began as occasional meetings soon turned into a committed relationship that he refused to let anyone see. He kept Avery tucked away in the corners of his life, convincing himself that protecting her from judgment was the reason he never brought her home. Avery saw the truth long before he admitted it. He wasn't protecting her. He was protecting himself. As the months passed, Avery grew increasingly aware that Michael had no intention of giving her a place in his world. Every time she talked about the future, he found an excuse to change the subject. When she asked to meet his family, he dismissed her with vague promises. Avery loved him, but she felt more like a secret he couldn't bear to lose yet couldn't bear to acknowledge. She tried to be patient, reminding herself that not everyone lived with her confidence, but patience slowly turned into exhaustion. She wanted a life where she wasn't treated like something shameful, and she hoped Michael would eventually understand that. He never did. When Michael met Emily Rhodes, everything changed overnight. Emily represented everything his family expected for him. Simple, traditional, and openly admired by the community, Michael convinced himself that a future with Emily would erase every complication in his past. He pulled away from Avery with cold precision, sending shorter messages, canceling visits, and finally ending the relationship without giving her a chance to process the emotional collapse he caused. Avery was left with unanswered questions, unspoken feelings, and a heartbreak shaped by betrayal. Michael believed ending the relationship would bury the truth. What he didn't know was that Avery had already found his engagement announcement online. She stared at the photo of Michael and Emily smiling under a decorated archway and felt a mixture of disbelief and devastation. She realized that Michael hadn't ended things because he needed space, but because he had been building a second life without her. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she expected from him. She began gathering the messages, photos, and reminders of their relationship, not out of revenge, but out of a desperate need to be acknowledged. She didn't want to expose him publicly. She wanted him to confront the pain he caused and take responsibility. But Michael saw the situation differently. He saw her discovery as a threat to the life he had carefully constructed. The fear that had controlled him for years intensified. He believed that any connection between him and Avery could shatter everything he had built with Emily and destroy the image he lived for. That fear marked the beginning of a tragedy he could no longer escape. The morning of the wedding carried a sense of celebration that spread across the small town. The church lawn was filled with guests dressed in soft colors, holding small gifts and arranging themselves for photos. Cars lined the street, and the air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood. Inside the church, volunteers moved quickly, adjusting ribbons, placing programs on seats, and making sure everything matched the carefully planned decorations Emily had chosen months earlier. To everyone watching, the day looked perfect. But beneath Michael's pristine exterior, a storm had been building quietly and relentlessly. For days leading up to the ceremony, Michael had been receiving anonymous messages that made his stomach tighten each time one appeared. Some were short, others long, but all of them pointed toward the same unsettling truth. Avery knew about the wedding and had no intention of staying silent. The fear that had followed him for years grew heavier with every notification. He tried to act normal, smiling for photos, greeting family members, and standing at the front of the church with practiced composure. But inside, every moment felt like he was waiting for something to break. Emily, glowing in her gown, was unaware of the tension he carried. She walked through the church halls with bridesmaids bustling around her, making last-minute adjustments. Her excitement contrasted sharply with Michael's growing dread. Each passing minute reminded him that Avery had the power to unravel his new beginning. He told himself she wouldn't show up. He told himself she would move on, accept the breakup, and let him live the life he had chosen. But each message he received suggested otherwise, and deep down he knew Avery well enough to understand she wouldn't be dismissed quietly. As guests filled the pews, quiet conversations rippled through the church. The organist prepared to begin the prelude, and the soft music floated through the sanctuary. Michael took his place near the altar, hands clasped tightly, heart pounding in a way he couldn't hide anymore. His best man gave him an encouraging nod, mistaking his panic for ordinary nerves. Michael tried to steady his breathing, but his mind kept circling back to Avery, her persistence, her disappointment, and the proof she held of their years together. Then the disturbance began. It was subtle at first, just a small wave of whispers from the back of the church. People turned their heads, some rising slightly from their seats to see what had drawn their attention. The ushers stood uncertain as a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the sunlight outside. Avery stepped inside with a calm that unsettled everyone who saw her. She carried no anger on her face, only a determined expression that conveyed she had come with purpose, not chaos. Her presence alone shattered the fragile illusion of control Michael had tried to maintain. Guests looked between Avery and Michael, sensing tension without understanding its source. Avery walked slowly, holding an envelope in her hand, one that contained the pieces of a past Michael had worked desperately to bury. In that moment, Michael felt the walls closing in. Everything he feared was now standing only a few steps away. Panic surged through him, overwhelming any rational thought. The ceremony had not yet begun, but the disaster he had been trying to prevent had already arrived. He knew that if Avery reached him in front of the entire congregation, the truth would spill out in a way he could never contain. His life, reputation, and future would be destroyed in real time. That single fear pushed him into action. He left his position at the front, slipping out through a side door before Avery could get closer. His quiet exit sent another ripple of whispers through the crowd. Avery followed him without hesitation, leaving behind a church full of confused and uneasy faces. The celebration that had been designed so carefully had already begun to unravel, and no one inside yet understood how dark the day was about to become. Michael moved quickly around the corner of the church, his steps uneven and unsteady as he tried to control the panic rushing through him. The sunlight felt harsher outside, exposing every flaw, every fear, every secret he had worked so hard to bury. He could hear faint murmurs from inside the church, an entire room full of people wondering why the groom had slipped away minutes before the ceremony. But Michael's mind was locked on one single thought, keeping Avery away from the life he had planned to start that day. He walked toward the back of the property, where the trees cast long shadows across the grass, giving him the privacy he desperately needed. It was the only place where he thought he could manage the crisis without hundreds of eyes watching. Avery followed him at a steady pace, her heels sinking slightly into the soft ground as she crossed the lawn. She wasn't angry and she didn't rush. Her calmness contrasted sharply with Michael's unraveling nerves. She had spent days deciding whether to come, replaying every moment of their past and every unanswered question that haunted her. When she found the courage to appear at the church, it wasn't for revenge. It was for closure. She carried the envelope not as a threat, but as a final attempt to make Michael confront the truth rather than hide from it. She hoped it would force him to look her in the eye and acknowledge the years they had shared. When they reached the secluded edge of the church grounds, Michael turned with a look that revealed the chaos inside him. His breaths were short, and his hands trembled from the weight of the moment. He had imagined many scenarios, but nothing prepared him for the reality of Avery standing there, her presence threatening the delicate balance of the life he was about to step into. He felt as though the world he had built was collapsing inch by inch, and he had no way to stop it. Avery lifted the envelope slightly, signaling that she wanted him to take it. Inside were printed screenshots, photos of their time together, and handwritten notes she had kept. They were pieces of a life he had demanded be hidden, pieces that proved he had lived dishonestly the entire time he courted Emily. Avery's intention was simple. She wanted him to face the truth, even if it was painful for both of them. She wanted him to acknowledge the emotional damage he caused by treating her like a disposable part of his past. But Michael didn't see the envelope as a plea for honesty. He saw it as a threat powerful enough to ruin him. His thoughts spiraled into worst-case scenarios: guests finding the papers, Emily seeing proof of his lies, his family discovering the relationship he had kept buried. In his fear, he convinced himself that Avery's arrival was an act of destruction aimed at him, not an attempt to find closure. The fear twisted the situation into something far more sinister in his mind. He remembered the handgun in his car, a weapon he normally kept for late night work travels and job site security. His panic pushed him toward irrational decisions. He walked to the car, opened the door, and grabbed the gun with a trembling hand. Every logical thought slipped away as fear drowned out reason. When he returned to the shaded area where Avery stood, she noticed the panic in his eyes but didn't recognize the depth of his desperation. She stepped closer, unaware that he had made a deadly decision in the span of only a few frantic minutes. The space between them felt thick with unspoken emotions: hurt, fear, betrayal, and confusion. Avery's intention had never been to destroy Michael's life. She only wanted acknowledgement. But Michael, overwhelmed by the collapse of the controlled image he had spent years crafting, saw no way out. In his mind, the appearance of Avery at his wedding meant the end of everything he valued. Fear consumed him, distorting every thought until he believed the only way to protect his future was to eliminate the source of the threat. Avery, unaware of the weapon he now held hidden just out of sight, extended the envelope one last time. She stood only a few steps away, hoping for honesty and a moment of truth. Michael stood opposite her, consumed by panic and prepared to make a choice that would turn a silent confrontation into a devastating tragedy that could never be undone. The moment Avery took another step forward, the last fragile thread of control inside Michael snapped. The air around them felt unnaturally still, as if the world was holding its breath. The church behind them remained alive with quiet music and soft conversations, unaware that only a few yards away a disaster was unfolding in slow motion. Michael's grip tightened around the gun hidden at his side, his thoughts tangled in panic and fear. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst through his ribs. Every imagined outcome played through his mind. Wedding ruined, family shocked, Emily shattered, reputation destroyed, future gone. His fear swallowed reason whole. Avery didn't see the gun at first. She only saw the distress on Michael's face, interpreting it as guilt or emotional conflict, rather than escalating danger. She lifted the envelope higher, trying to give him a chance to take it, believing this confrontation would finally force him to confront everything he had been running from. She didn't understand that Michael wasn't thinking about healing or honesty. He was thinking about exposure. He was thinking about survival. The fear had warped his perception so severely that the woman standing before him no longer represented a person he once cared for. She represented a threat he believed he needed to eliminate. When Michael finally raised the gun, it happened in a sudden, frantic motion. Avery's eyes widened, but she didn't even have time to react fully. Before a sound could escape her, the gun fired. The crack of the gunshot split through the quiet churchyard like lightning tearing through a calm sky. Birds scattered from the trees. The sound traveled through the open church doors and bounced off the walls inside, sending a wave of confusion through the guests. Some paused mid-sentence. Others turned instinctively toward the entrance, unsure of what they had heard. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, sensing something terribly wrong. Outside, Avery stumbled backward, her body folding as she collapsed onto the grass. The envelope slipped from her hand, landing beside her as its contents scattered in the wind. Papers drifted across the ground. Photos, messages, fragments of a life Michael could no longer deny, fluttering like broken pieces of truth that refused to stay hidden. Michael stared at her motionless form with shock spreading across his face, the gun still trembling in his hand. His mind, moments earlier flooded with fear, now stood empty except for the horrifying reality of what he had done. A scream pierced the air when a passerby on the sidewalk saw Avery on the ground. The sound carried into the church, igniting panic among the guests. People rushed outside, forming a chaotic crowd around the back corner of the building. Emily, still in her wedding gown, followed them, her train dragging through the grass as she forced her way through the confusion. When she saw Michael standing there with the gun, his hands shaking uncontrollably, her world shattered instantly. The shock on her face mirrored the shock on everyone else's. Michael tried to hide the gun, fumbling with the fabric of his jacket, but the attempt was pointless. Too many eyes had seen it. Too many people had witnessed the haunting stillness of the scene. The fallen woman, the blood darkening the grass, the groom standing over her like a man lost in the aftermath of his own nightmare. Michael stammered incoherently, unable to form a believable explanation. His fear had driven him to the edge, but now the adrenaline drained from his body, leaving only guilt and confusion behind. Sirens wailed in the distance as someone called emergency services. The flashing lights soon lit up the churchyard, casting blue and red shadows over the chaotic scene. Officers moved quickly, separating the crowd and approaching Michael with caution. He didn't resist when they took the gun from him. He didn't protest when they placed him in handcuffs. He simply stared at Avery's still form, realizing too late that the truth he feared had been replaced by something far worse. The life he had desperately tried to protect was already ruined, and Emily's quiet sobs in the background confirmed the full weight of what he had destroyed. The church, once filled with excitement and celebration, now stood silent behind them, its decorations swaying gently in the breeze, an eerie reminder of a future that vanished the moment the gunshot echoed across the lawn. The tragedy was no longer a secret. The truth was exposed, irreversible, and now belonged to everyone who had witnessed the aftermath of Michael's catastrophic choice. In the days following Avery's death, the town found itself plunged into a storm of confusion, shock, and relentless speculation. News of the shooting spread faster than anyone could process, filling conversations in grocery stores, church groups, and workplaces. The idea that a groom had killed someone behind the church minutes before exchanging vows was impossible for most people to comprehend. For those who knew Michael, it felt like discovering a stranger living behind the familiar face they had trusted for years. For those who knew Avery, the heartbreak of losing her eclipsed every attempt to make sense of the tragedy. Her friends and co-workers shared memories of her kindness, her honesty, and the quiet strength she carried through life, emphasizing that she deserved more than secrecy and a violent end. Investigators worked quickly, collecting the scattered papers from the churchyard and piecing together Avery's relationship with Michael. The messages between them revealed a connection far deeper than Michael had ever admitted. The photos showed moments of genuine closeness, contradicting the narrative he initially tried to present. The more evidence emerged, the harder it became for Michael to maintain any claim that the shooting had been accidental or unavoidable. The investigators concluded that fear of exposure had driven him into a panic that turned deadly. The state built a strong case, positioning the shooting as an act rooted in desperation and selfishness rather than a momentary lapse. Emily withdrew into silence in the days after the tragedy. She left the town, staying with relatives who shielded her from the media frenzy that erupted around the failed wedding. Reporters camped outside the church, spoke to neighbors, and turned the story into a statewide spectacle. Emily struggled with the realization that the man she had planned to marry had not only betrayed her emotionally, but had taken a life out of fear of being exposed. She grappled with the idea that she had been living beside someone she never truly knew. Within a week, her family filed for an annulment, making it clear she wanted no ties to Michael or the tragedy that had unfolded. During the trial, Michael sat with a hollow expression, listening as prosecutors painted a vivid picture of the choices that led to Avery's death. They emphasized how calculated his actions appeared, from leading her away from the church to retrieving the gun to confronting her in a secluded area. His defense tried to argue panic and emotional overwhelm, but the jury remained unmoved by explanations that failed to justify such an extreme response. The courtroom heard testimony from Avery's friends and co-workers who described her dreams, her openness, and her desire only to be accepted for who she was. Their words painted a stark contrast to the fear-driven image of Michael's final moments with her. When the verdict was delivered, there was no dramatic outburst from Michael. He sat in silence as the judge sentenced him to decades in prison for second-degree murder. The weight of the sentence reflected the gravity of a life taken senselessly and the ripple of destruction left behind. Michael's family distanced themselves publicly, unable to reconcile the son they loved with the man responsible for such a tragedy. The church community, once proud of its stability and unity, struggled to rebuild its sense of safety after witnessing the darkest moment in its history occur on what was meant to be a joyful day. Avery's story continued to gain attention long after the trial. Advocacy groups spoke about the dangers of secrecy, internalized fear, and the violent outcomes that can arise when someone feels forced to live a double life. Her friends organized a small memorial in the city where she had lived, decorating a quiet park area with flowers, candles, and photos that captured her radiant smile. They remembered her not for the circumstances of her death, but for the courage she carried in seeking truth and closure. In the end, the tragedy stood as a reminder that fear and secrecy can destroy far more than reputations. They can take lives. Michael's attempt to protect an image had cost him everything, but it had cost Avery far more. Her life ended in a moment she hoped would bring understanding, not violence. And while the town eventually moved forward, the memory of that day remained a solemn reminder of the devastating consequences of hiding the truth.